why God said yes to Satan's wager over Job. There's a moment near the very beginning of the book of Job that most people skip right past. And honestly, it might be one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire Bible. Two beings are having a conversation in heaven. One of them is God. The other is Satan. And by the time their conversation is over, a good and innocent man named Job has lost almost everything he loves. His livestock, gone. His servants, dead. And his 10 children, all of them killed in a single afternoon. And here's the part that keeps people up at night. God didn't stop it. In fact, God is the one who brought Job's name up in the first place. So the question we have to sit with today is a hard one. Why would a good God agree to let Satan tear apart the life of a man he himself called blameless? Was it a bet? Was it cruelty? Was it a test? Because if you've ever looked at your own suffering or watched someone you love go through something they didn't deserve, this story hits a nerve. So let's slow it all the way down and look at what's actually happening here, because the real answer is far stranger and far deeper than a simple wager. Before we get to heaven, we need to meet the man on the ground. In the opening lines, we're told Job lived in a land called Uz, and that he was, in the words of the text, blameless and upright, a man who feared God and turned away from evil. Now, blameless doesn't mean sinless or perfect. It means his life had integrity, what he believed, and how he lived lined up. He wasn't pretending. And Job was rich. We're talking seriously, almost absurdly wealthy. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a huge household of servants. He's described as the greatest man among all the people of the East. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he was the kind of father who worried about their souls. After his kids would throw feasts, Job would get up early and offer sacrifices on their behalf, just in case any of them had sinned in their hearts. That's the picture. A man who had everything and who handled everything with reverence. Remember that, because it matters for what comes next. Now the camera cuts to heaven. And the scene we get is something most people don't expect. The text says there was a day when the sons of God, the heavenly beings, came to present themselves before the Lord. Think of it like a royal court assembling before a king. And among them came one called in Hebrew Satan. Now stop right there, because this word matters more than almost anything else in the story. We read the word Satan and we instantly picture a red figure with horns and a pitchfork, the cosmic villain, God's arch enemy. But that image comes from centuries of later art and folklore. In this ancient Hebrew text, Satan isn't really a name. It's a title. It means the accuser or the adversary. Picture a prosecutor in a courtroom. His job is to bring charges, to challenge, to scrutinize. So when this figure walks into the heavenly court, he's not breaking in as an enemy. He's showing up as a kind of cosmic prosecutor, looking for someone to accuse. And God, almost like he's leading the witness, asks him a question. Where have you come from? And the accuser answers that he's been roaming around the earth, walking back and forth across it. Then God does something that on a first read feels almost reckless. He brings up Job. Have you considered my servant Job? God says. There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. And that's the setup for everything. God didn't have to mention Job, but he points to him with what almost sounds like pride. This is my guy. Look how faithful he is. And the accuser has been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Here comes the line that the entire book is built on. The accuser looks at God and asks one devastating question. Does Job fear God for nothing? In other words, sure, Job loves you, but why wouldn't he? Look at his life. Look at what you've given him. The accuser points out that God has put a hedge around Job, a wall of protection around him and his household, and everything he owns. You've blessed the work of his hands, he says. His wealth keeps multiplying. Of course he worships you. You've paid him to. And then the accuser throws down the real challenge. Stretch out your hand, he says, and take away everything he has, and he will curse you to your face. Now, this is the heart of the whole thing, and it's so easy to miss because we're distracted by the drama. The accuser is not really making a bet about Job. He's making an accusation about love itself. He's saying that no one, not one single human being, actually loves God for who God is. He's claiming that all faith is fundamentally a transaction. People only worship God because of what they get out of it. Take away the paycheck and the worship stops. Strip away the blessings and you'll see what was really underneath all along. Just self-interest. Do you see how much bigger this is than Job? The accuser is putting the integrity of every faithful person on trial. He's saying genuine, selfless devotion to God simply doesn't exist. It's a fantasy. And he's pointing at the most faithful man alive and saying, even him, even your best example, is a fraud. He just hasn't been tested yet. So now we arrive at the question we came here to answer. Why does God say yes? Because that's exactly what he does. God responds very simply, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only do not lay a finger on the man himself. And just like that, the door is opened. So why? Why would God allow this? Let me give you a few layers, because there isn't one tidy answer. And anyone who tells you there's probably hasn't sat with this book very long. First, notice what God is not doing. God is not the one who attacks Job. Read it carefully. God grants permission, but it's the accuser who reaches out and destroys. That distinction runs all the way through the book. God permits. God doesn't perpetrate. Now, you can absolutely wrestle with whether permitting suffering is morally any different from causing it. And people have argued about that for thousands of years. But the text is deliberate about the difference. God is not gleefully ruining a man's life. He's allowing a challenge to play out. Second, look at the limits. God doesn't hand Job over and walk away. He draws a hard line. Everything Job has is fair game, but the man himself cannot be touched. Later, when the accuser comes back for round 2, God allows Job's health to be attacked, but again sets a boundary. You may not take his life. So even in the middle of what feels like chaos, God is holding the leash. The suffering is real, but it is never unlimited and never out of his control. There is a fence around the fire the whole time, but here's the deepest reason, and it's the one that reframes everything. The accuser made a claim that struck at the very nature of God's relationship with human beings. He said love for God is impossible without bribery, that faith is always a paycheck. And think about what that means. If the accuser is right, then God can never actually be loved. He can only be used. every prayer, every act of worship would just be a person managing their investment, keeping the blessings flowing. A God who can only be used, never truly loved, is a lonely and diminished God. So the question on the table isn't really, is Job tough enough? The question is, can a human being love God for God's sake? Can goodness exist when there's nothing in it for you? And the only way to answer that question is to remove the reward and see what's left. You can't prove that someone loves you for you and not for your money while you're still writing them checks. The check has to stop. And as agonizing as it is, that's the logic of what unfolds. The blessings are pulled back, not because God doesn't love Job, but because Job's love is the very thing being vindicated. Which brings us to the worst day of Job's life. It happens fast, almost cruelly fast. Job is at home when a messenger runs up, breathless. The oxen and donkeys were grazing when raiders swept in, stole them, and killed the servants. I alone escaped to tell you. Before that man even finishes, a second messenger arrives. Fire fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the shepherds. I alone escaped to tell you. Then a third. Raiders took the camels and put the servants to the sword. I alone escaped to tell you. And then the fourth, and this is the one that breaks your heart. Your sons and daughters were feasting together in the oldest brother's house, the messenger says, when a great wind came in from across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them. They're all dead, and I alone escaped to tell you. In the span of a few minutes, Job goes from the greatest man in the East to a man with nothing. So what does he do? This is the moment the accuser has been betting on. Job stands up. He tears his robe. He shaves his head. Signs of unbearable grief in that culture. And then he falls to the ground, but not to curse. He falls down and he worships, and he says these words that people have clung to in their darkest hours ever since. Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The text adds one quiet line. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. The accuser was wrong. Job's faith wasn't a paycheck after all, but the accuser doesn't give up. There's a second scene in heaven almost identical to the first, and this time the accuser sharpens his knife. Skin for skin, he says. A man will give everything he has to save his own life. Sure, Job kept his faith when he lost his stuff and even his kids. But make it personal. Touch his own body, his own bones and flesh, and then watch him curse you. And once again, God allows it within a limit. You may afflict him, but you must spare his life. So Job is struck with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. He ends up sitting in ashes, scraping his skin with a piece of broken pottery. And in that state, his wife, who has lost those same 10 children, who is drowning in her own grief, looks at him and says the thing a lot of us might say. Are you still holding on to your integrity? Just curse God and die. And Job's answer is gentle but firm. Shall we accept good from God and not accept trouble? Once again, the text notes Job did not sin with his lips. Now, before we go any further, we have to clear up some things this story is not saying, because people have weaponized this book in painful ways. This story is not teaching that every time you suffer, it's because God and Satan are making bets about you. Job is a unique case, a one-of-a-kind exploration of a cosmic question, not a formula for everyday life. And the story is definitely not saying that suffering always means you did something to deserve it. In fact, the longest part of the book is all about demolishing that idea. After Job loses everything, 3 friends show up: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And at first they do something beautiful. They sit with him in silence for 7 days. But then they open their mouths and they spend chapter after chapter insisting that Job must have sinned. You're suffering, they argue, so you must have earned it. God is just. Bad things happen to bad people. So confess, Job, and this will all stop. It sounds reasonable, it sounds religious. And it is completely wrong, because we, the readers, we're in the room in heaven. We know Job didn't do anything to deserve this. So the friends are confidently explaining a man's pain with a theory that we know is false. And that's the trap so many of us fall into. When we see someone suffer, we want a clean reason. We want the math to add up. The book of Job stands up and says sometimes the math doesn't add up, and the people insisting it does are doing real harm. So if the friends are wrong, and Job is innocent, and God won't explain himself, where does the book finally land? After all the arguing, after a younger man named Elihu adds his thoughts, God finally speaks. And how God answers is just stunning, because he doesn't answer the question, not the way you'd expect. God speaks out of a whirlwind, a storm, and instead of explaining the wager, instead of justifying the suffering, he starts asking Job questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Have you ever commanded the morning to appear? Do you know how the mountain goats give birth? Can you bind the stars? Can you pull in the great sea creature, the Leviathan, with a hook? Question after question about oceans and storms and wild animals and the deep structure of the universe. And the point isn't to bully Job into silence. The point is a kind of reframe. God is essentially saying, Job, you are looking at one thread of an unimaginably vast tapestry. And you're assuming that because you can't see the pattern, there isn't one. You don't have the vantage point to run the universe, and you don't have the vantage point to fully understand your own suffering either. But the one who holds the stars in place also holds you. Now that might frustrate you. It frustrates a lot of people. Job asked why, and God basically answered with who. Who do you think you're talking to? And yet, Job's response isn't anger, it's peace. He says, I had heard of you with my ears, but now my eyes have seen you. He stops needing the answer because he's encountered the answerer. The relationship turned out to be deeper than the explanation he was demanding. And in the end, the story turns. God rebukes the 3 friends, by the way, for not speaking rightly about him, the way Job had. Let that sink in. The men who defended God with their tidy theology got corrected. The man who wrestled and argued and demanded answers got affirmed. Then God restores Job. He gives him twice as much as he had before. 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels. He has 7 more sons and 3 more daughters, said to be the most beautiful women in all the land. And Job lives another 140 years, long enough to see 4 generations of his family. The accuser is never mentioned again. He simply vanishes from the story, because his accusation has already been answered. He claimed no one loves God for nothing. And a broken man sitting in ashes who had lost everything and gained no explanation. proved him wrong. Job's faith, stripped of every reward, was still real. That was the verdict the whole cosmic trial was after. So let's come back to where we started. Why did God say yes to the wager? Not because he was gambling, not because Job's life was a toy, but because a question had been raised that struck at the heart of what it means to love God at all. Is faith just a transaction? Can devotion survive when the blessings are gone? And the only way to answer that, devastating as it is, was to let the test happen within limits God never released his grip on. And maybe that's why this ancient story still grabs us so hard, because most of us, at some point, will face our own version of the whirlwind, a loss we can't explain, a pain that doesn't fit any formula, and we'll cry out why. The book of Job doesn't hand us a neat answer. What it offers instead is something harder and strangely more comforting. It tells us that our suffering is not proof that God has stopped caring, or that we've done something to deserve it. It tells us there may be more going on than we can see from where we're standing. And it tells us the faith doesn't require having all the answers. Sometimes it just requires staying in the room with God when the answers don't come. Job never found out about the conversation in heaven. He never knew there was a reason. He just kept holding on. And in the end, that was enough. So here's what I'll leave you with. The next time life takes something from you and the math refuses to add up, remember the man in the ashes. Remember that the silence isn't always absence. And ask yourself the question this whole strange, beautiful book is really asking. Not why is this happening to me, but who is still with me in it? If this gave you something to think about, take a moment to sit with it, and we'll see you in the next one.